So a couple days ago, I talked about the contrast between Esther and Haman has two different ways of being in a compromised world. Haman being the way of seeking for self, for one's own glory, using other people as a means to an end, destroying one's enemies, versus Esther, the way of self-gift, of being willing to be vulnerable, to put oneself in play on behalf of the life of others, to put oneself in the place of others, to share their danger and their their sufferings. And so you have this compare contrast. And so now in the climactic scene, the confrontation between these two ways of Esther and Haman, in a sense, we're called, since we have to recognize that we have both that Haman and that Esther living in us. And we are called to choose the way of Esther. And in a sense, this isn't a kind of a neutral decision. There is no neutral ground between Esther and Haman, right? Esther kind of names it. She says, well, if it was just to be sold into slavery, where, eventually we could get free, or, in a sense, we all serve the king anyway. And so, I'm more or less the king's slave here as the queen. That wouldn't have made a difference. But she names the kind of Haman has the existential threat that he is to, again, the existence of her people, her own life. And in a sense, we need to come to terms with the fact that the Haman within us is an existential threat to our spiritual lives, that we cannot exist in communion with God as long as that Haman in us continues to live and breathe. We must put that Haman to death. This is, in a sense, what Paul would describe as being crucified with Christ, allowing the world or allowing sin to be crucified in us. We have to put the Haman in us, the self-loving, self-seeking, self-defending kind of part of us, person in us. We have to put that person to death. We have to allow that person to be under the judgment of the Most High King, Jesus, and be crucified with him, so that we might rise to a newness of life, and that we might know the abundance that God has prepared for those who are willing to give themselves to God's people and to God's mission. So let us be clear about the existential threat that the Haman in us poses to our spiritual life, poses to our ability to know God's love for us and to be able to serve God's mission. And let us be decisive and be of good courage, and let the Esther in us prevail in the moment of moral decision. A reading from the book of Esther. The king and Haman went in to the feast with Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me. That is my petition, and the lives of my people. That is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace. But no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who has presumed to do this?" Esther said, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. The king rose from the feast in wrath and went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed to beg his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that the king had determined to destroy him. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman had thrown himself on the couch where Esther was reclining, and the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" As the words left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Look, the very gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king abated. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.